U.S. history sweeps through a string of conflicts that have ultimately made the country the world's greatest military power and have also shaped the global geopolitical landscape. From the War of Independence establishing the United States as a sovereign entity to contemporary military interventions in regions such as the Middle East and Afghanistan, America's military footprint has remained a constant in world history. Today's video looks at every war the U.S. has ever been involved in its extensive military history. The United States of America came into being on the back of its first war, the American War of Independence, otherwise known as the American Revolution, between 1775 and 1783. This conflict prompted the 13 colonies in North America to gain independence from the British Empire. Originally, this revolutionary movement started as a quarrel over the right of the American colonists to rule themselves and withstand British tax policies. Armed hostilities started with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The Second Continental Congress reacted by forming the Continental Army, headed by George Washington. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson, proclaiming the sovereignty of the colonies. The conflict was a long and challenging affair for the American forces, facing the powerful British Army and Hessian mercenaries, with significant battles such as Saratoga as a crucial turning point in the war. British General John Burgoyne's surrender after it persuaded France that the Americans stood a real chance of winning, pushing them to enter the war on the side of the colonies. French support was vital to the American war effort. After the American victory at Saratoga, French assistance was key, providing essential military and naval support. The Battle of Yorktown was the final and decisive engagement of the war. The siege of Yorktown, with the French and American forces working in tandem, led to the surrender of British General Lord Cornwallis. The victory at Yorktown brought an effective end to hostilities. The conflict concluded with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, formally recognizing the United States' independence. This influenced other independence campaigns around the world. The American Indian Wars comprised several conflicts between Native American peoples. These clashes were typified by a succession of battles, campaigns, and massacres, frequently resulting in the forced removal of native tribes from their ancestral lands. Policies such as the doctrine of manifest destiny, promoting the United States' belief in territorial expansion as inevitable and warranted, heightened tensions. The United States clashed with several indigenous nations, including tribes such as the Cherokee, Sioux, Comanche, Apache, Navajos, and many more. Each of these nations had their own cultures, territories, and interaction backgrounds with the colonizers. Confrontations ranged in scale and intensity from small skirmishes to drawn-out wars. Some of the most notable include the Black Hawk War, the Seminole Wars, the 1862 Sioux War, the Apache Wars, and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Most of these ended with agreements that were seldom beneficial to the indigenous peoples and often resulted in their forced relocation to reservations. The aftermath of these wars was crippling for Native American peoples, resulting in significant losses of life, land, and culture. On top of this, U.S. expansion continued to exert pressure on indigenous lands, resulting in even more conflicts and displacement. The War of 1812, also known as the United States' Second War of Independence between the United States and the British Empire, lasted from 1812 to 1815. The war's major triggers included the British trade restrictions enforced as part of its naval blockade against France during the Napoleonic Wars, and the British practice of impressment, consisting of capturing American sailors and forcing them into servitude in the Royal Navy. There were also tensions over American westward expansion and British support for Native American tribes in opposing this spread. The outbreak of the war was fraught with military challenges for the United States, facing several defeats in attempts to invade Canada, then a British colony. Outnumbered at sea, the United States scored several notable triumphs, such as the USS Constitution's defeat of the HMS Gruyere. The conflict witnessed significant moments, such as the Battle of Baltimore and the Battle of New Orleans, where the American forces led by Andrew Jackson won a decisive victory in January 1815. The peace treaty mostly reinstated pre-war frontier conditions and did not resolve many of the underlying issues that brought about the conflict. The war did, however, strengthen American nationalism. After securing its independence and expanding westward, the United States clashed with Mexico. The Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848 stemmed from territorial squabbles and was a crucial point in the United States' territorial expansion under the Manifest Destiny Doctrine. This conflict was ignited by the U.S. annexation of Texas in 1845. Texas had become independent from Mexico in 1836, but the latter never granted it independence and considered it a rebel province. When the United States annexed Texas, territorial disputes between Texas and Mexico flared up. U.S. President James K. Polk, a supporter of territorial expansionism, sent troops into the contested area, leading to fighting that triggered the war. The quarrel was marred by several major battles, such as the battles of Palo Alto, Monterrey, and Buena Vista in northern Mexico, and Winfield Scott's dramatic campaign that ended up capturing Mexico City. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo put a formal end to the war. This agreement saw Mexico relinquish a large amount of territory to the United States, including the current states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. The 1861 to 1865 American Civil War turned into one of the most crucial and transformative episodes in the U.S. history. This bloody clash was fought mainly over disagreements on the issues of slavery and states' rights to have slaves. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery into new American territories. 11 southern states, where the economy was heavily dependent on slavery, seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, led by Jefferson Davis. The conflict opened in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, a Union post. This raid heralded the outbreak of a 4-year bloody conflict. It was fought on many fronts, from Virginia through Tennessee to Mississippi. The Union, backed by the more industrious and populous northern states, had significant assets in terms of resources and manpower. The Confederacy of southern states, with a slave-based agricultural economy, grappled with the downside of less industrial infrastructure and less extensive railroad network. Major battles included Antietam, Vicksburg, and with Gettysburg being particularly notable as the war's turning point. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, proclaiming the freedom of slaves in the rebellious states and turning the moral character of the war on its head. It ended when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. Lincoln was assassinated shortly afterwards, a tragic epilogue to the conflict. The Civil War's aftermath was profound. Slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, and the entire course of American history was forever upended. The war also led to approximately 620,000 deaths, making it the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. The period following the war, called Reconstruction, saw efforts to reintegrate the southern states into the Union and to establish civil rights for freed people, although many of these achievements were reversed in the following decades. The Spanish-American War was a short-term but major conflict in the Caribbean and Asia in 1898, in which the United States and the Spanish Empire clashed. The war originated in the independence of Cuba, then a Spanish colony. Cubans had been fighting for their independence for years, and their struggles won sympathy in the United States. U.S. support for the Cuban struggle was nurtured by an intense sensationalist journalism effort, overblowing events to stir up public opinion against Spain. The firing point of the conflict was the USS Maine's mysterious explosion in Havana in February 1898. While the exact cause of the accident was never ascertained, a Spanish mine was blamed for it by the American press and public opinion. The outcry prompted President William McKinley to yield and declare war on Spain. It was a remarkably short affair, only lasting about 4 months. American forces scored quick victories with major actions in the Pacific. such as the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines and in the Caribbean, particularly in Santiago de Cuba. The Treaty of Paris, agreed in December 1898, sealed the war. Spain gave up all rights to Cuba and handed over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. Acquiring these territories represented the first time that the United States exercised significant colonial control outside the North American continent. The Spanish-American War caused significant repercussions. It was a milestone for the United States in its transformation into an imperial power, and for Spain, it symbolized the end of its empire. In the First World War, the United States had a crucial role to play, albeit later in the conflict. The conflict broke out in 1914, but the U.S. remained neutral until 1917. This reflected American isolationism, one of its diplomatic tenets, and the desire to avoid involvement in European disputes. But a series of events eventually led the U.S. to enter the war. What triggered the U.S. entry into the conflict was Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats were targeting vessels they considered to be providing support to the Allies without exception, including civilian and neutral ships. The 1915 sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship with numerous Americans on board, ignited outrage in the U.S., but did not immediately lead to war. In 1917, a turning point was the German decision to restart unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening the neutrality and safety of American ships. The other principal factor was the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, a German communication suggesting a military alliance with Mexico if the U.S. entered the war. The cable proposed that, in exchange for Mexican support, Germany would help to recover its lost territories in the United States. The release of this telegram inflamed American public opinion against Germany. President Woodrow Wilson called on Congress to declare war on Germany on April 2, 1917, on the grounds that the world needed to be safe for democracy. The declaration of war was passed, and the U.S. entered the conflict on the side of the Allies. In 1917, when the U.S. entered the war, the Allied forces were depleted after years of brutal combat. More than 2 million soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John J. Pershing, provided a crucial boost. The arrival of these energized and fresh troops contributed to reversing the Allies' morale and physical deterioration. American troops performed key missions in several decisive battles at the end of the war, including the Second Battle of the Marne and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. These were crucial battles in breaking the German lines and forcing an eventual retreat. While the U.S. was not the only decisive factor in the Allied victory, its entry into the war in 1917 and the ensuing contributions, in terms of both human and material resources, were key to changing the course of the war. The American footprint sped up the conflict's end and shaped the scenario for the post-war period, establishing the U.S. as a prominent world power. The Second World War commenced in 1939, but the United States kept its policy of neutrality while providing material aid to the Allies through programs such as the Lend-Lease Act. But the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, led the United States to enter the war for good. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan the following day, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing the country into the war in Europe as well as in the Pacific. The United States also played a decisive role in the European theater. Having been involved in the North African and Italian invasions, they were key to D-Day, the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, signaling the start of the Western European liberation from Nazi rule. The U.S. military presence and industrial output were vital to the Allied efforts. The U.S. led the fight against Japan in the Pacific theater. Key campaigns included the battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The American strategy of island hopping or leapfrogging sought to capture crucial islands and use them as bases from which to attack Japan. The U.S. industrial capacity was one of the Allies' strongest assets. The large-scale production of weaponry, vehicles, aircraft, and ships was essential to the war effort. Developing and using the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 was also decisive for Japan's surrender and the end of the war. The Second World War also had far-reaching social and economic ramifications in the United States. Its war efforts spurred on the economy, putting an end to the Great Depression. It also wrought significant changes in society, including the role of women in the workforce and racial inclusion in the armed forces. The war's end brought about the emergence of the United States as one of the world's two superpowers, alongside the Soviet Union, setting stage for the Cold War. From 1950 to 1953, the Korean War was a major milestone in the United States military history and one of the most notable events of the Cold War. This clash on the Korean Peninsula embroiled the U.S. Armed Forces in a struggle against Communist North Korea and its allies, including China and, indirectly, the Soviet Union. It began on June 25, 1950, when North Korea, aided by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. Under the UN banner and supported by several other countries, the United States stepped in to help South Korea. Harry S. Truman, the American president at the time, regarded the invasion as a trial on the principle of containing communist expansion, as set out in the Truman Doctrine. General Douglas MacArthur's U.S.-led UN forces staged an amphibious landing at Incheon, a turning point in the war. This successful operation resulted in the recapture of Seoul, the South Korean capital, and pushed the North Korean forces past the 38th parallel, the original watershed. When the UN troops neared the border with China on the Yalu River, however, China entered the war on North Korea's side, triggering a series of setbacks and breakthroughs for the UN forces. The war turned into a bloody stalemate with heavy fighting. The Korean War was noted for its brutality and harsh conditions, with heavy casualties on both sides. Advanced air and ground tactics were used extensively, but it was also a war where direct confrontation and trench battles were widespread. The conflict ended with an armistice signed on July 27, 1953, establishing the Korean Demilitarized Zone that continues to bisect the Korean Peninsula. No formal peace treaty was signed, and technically North and South Korea are still at war. The Korean War had major consequences. It was one of the first serious conflicts of the Cold War, proving the United States' readiness to use military force to contain communism. It also had a profound influence on American politics and society, leading to changes in military doctrine and foreign policy, leaving the isolationist doctrine behind finally. It also cemented the U.S. alliance with South Korea, a partnership that still lasts today. It is often referred to as the Forgotten War in the United States, on account of its place between the Second World War and the Vietnam War, but its lessons remain relevant. The Vietnam War was a drawn-out and contentious affair that profoundly marked the United States' history, militarily, socially, and politically. The Vietnam War goes back to the country's division into Communist North Vietnam and anti-Communist South Vietnam in the wake of the First Indochina War. Driven by its policy of curbing communism and the domino theory, i.e. the belief that one country's fall to communism would lead to the sequential collapse of other countries in the region, the United States threw its support behind the South Vietnamese government. The U.S. support initially involved economic and military aid, but gradually turned into direct engagement. Throughout the years under President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, the number of military advisors and aid increased significantly. After the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, where U.S. warships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, Lyndon Johnson secured the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, granting the president broad authority to boost the U.S. military presence in Vietnam. The U.S. embarked on a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam in 1965, with Operation Rolling Thunder, and stationed large numbers of combat troops in South Vietnam. The peak of U.S. military involvement occurred in 1969, with around 540,000 soldiers in Vietnam. During that period, the U.S. encountered a persistent guerrilla war of Viet Cong fighters and the North Vietnamese Army's standard forces. The war featured harsh combat conditions, guerrilla warfare tactics, and the controversial use of chemical agents, such as Agent Orange. There was also intense media coverage, broadcasting the grim realities of the conflict to the American public, fomenting a growing anti-war movement. Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, embraced the Vietnamization policy, progressively transferring combat responsibilities to the South Vietnamese Army and reducing American troops. Meanwhile, peace negotiations were held in Paris. The 1973 Paris Peace Accords were eventually signed, leading to the withdrawal of American forces. But the war continued between North and South Vietnam until the fall of Saigon in 1975, leading to Vietnam's reunification under communist rule. The Vietnam War had a significant impact on the United States. It sparked a deep political and social rift, prompted a reassessment of foreign and military policies, and left lasting scars on the combat veterans. The war also marked the U.S.'s first military defeat. Also known as Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War was a military conflagration that took place in 1990, representing a turning point in Middle Eastern politics and in U.S. military history. It was triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, led by Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. He justified the invasion by alleging historical disputes over the territory and accusing Kuwait of jeopardizing the Iraqi economy by surpassing the OPEC oil production quotas. Iraq's aggressive action was instantly condemned by the international community, and the UN imposed economic sanctions on the country. Under President George Bush, the United States took a leading role in forming an international coalition to counter the invasion. It included NATO countries, Arab nations, and other nations, totaling 34 countries. The objective was clear: to oust Iraqi forces from Kuwait and reinstate the country's sovereignty. Following months of preparation and an ultimatum for Iraqi withdrawal, the war started in January 1991 with an extensive air campaign aiming at Iraq's military and communications infrastructure. This was followed by a swift ground offensive in February, lasting just 100 hours before Iraqi forces were routed and Kuwait liberated. One remarkable aspect of the Gulf War was the widespread use of advanced military technology by the United States and its allies. This included precision weapons, stealth aircraft, electronic warfare, and satellite systems. It was also notable for its media coverage, as one of the first conflicts to be broadcast almost instantaneously to a global audience on television. The Gulf War ended in February 1991 when Kuwait was liberated. The conflict had a major impact on the region and the world. It established the United States as the hegemonic military power at the end of the Cold War and shifted the Middle East's geopolitical dynamics. The war in Afghanistan stemmed from the 9/11 attacks carried out by the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden, which was based in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. The U.S., under the presidency of George W. Bush, launched Operation Enduring Freedom to respond to the attacks. It aimed to dismantle Al-Qaeda and dislodge the Taliban from power for having sheltered and supported Al-Qaeda. The operation began in October 2001 with an air bombing campaign followed by a ground invasion, which rapidly toppled the Taliban regime. But the war stretched far beyond its initial mission. Once the Taliban fell, the United States and its NATO allies engaged in a long and cumbersome counterinsurgency and reconstruction effort. While the Taliban was initially defeated, they continued to exist as an insurgency, regularly launching attacks against coalition forces and the Western-backed Afghan government. Challenges faced by the U.S. and its allies included Afghanistan's rugged geography, the country's intricate tribal and political dynamics, and the presence of other militant groups, such as the Haqqani and the Islamic State. The United States attempted multiple pacification strategies and efforts over the years, training and supporting the Afghan army and police, and several reconstruction and development initiatives. The cost of the war was massive, both in terms of lives lost and financial resources. It also had a profound impact on Afghan society, resulting in significant civilian losses and population displacement. The U.S. involvement in the war gradually altered over the years, steadily reducing troops and boosting the role of the Afghan security forces. Under Donald Trump's presidency, the United States signed an agreement with the Taliban in 2020, paving the way for the withdrawal of American troops. This was finalized under President Joe Biden in August 2021, officially ending the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. The embarrassing U.S. withdrawal and the ensuing swift takeover by the Taliban in 2021 was a major blow to the U.S. government. Footage of Afghans desperately clinging to U.S. aircraft in a last-ditch attempt to escape typifies the humanitarian crisis Afghanistan has been left in after 20 years of intervention and war. Starting in 2003, the Iraq War was unleashed by a U.S.-led coalition invasion of Iraq under the presidency of George W. Bush, with Britain as its key ally. This was justified by bogus, fabricated allegations and forged intelligence documents to mislead public opinion that Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorist groups. After a period of heavy diplomacy and debate in the United Nations, the invasion began in March 2003, when the U.S. and its allies failed to secure a resolution explicitly authorizing the use of force. The war's initial phase started with a heavy air attack, known as shock and awe, followed by a ground invasion. Coalition forces quickly pushed forward, facing varying resistance. The major fights during this phase included the Battle of Nasiriyah and the Battle of Basra. Baghdad's fall in April effectively ended Saddam Hussein's regime. But the Americans failed in locating the weapons of mass destruction that had been quoted as the main rationale for the war. The absence of these weapons, which never existed, led to substantial questions about the validity of the intelligence reports used to launch the war and whether the invasion was justified. After Saddam's overthrow, Iraq was engulfed in chaos. The coalition's move to disband the Iraqi army and the banning of Saddam's Ba'ath Party members from holding public office all contributed to a power vacuum. It led to a growing insurgency against the coalition forces and the new Western-backed Iraqi government. This conflict evolved into a violent sectarian war, escalating tensions between Iraq's Shiite, Sunni, and Kurdish groups. The United States and its allies came under international criticism for their actions and for claims of human rights violations, including the mistreatment of prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison. Internally, the war became increasingly unpopular as casualties rose and the mission's objectives seemed less clear. It also had far-reaching implications in the region. It contributed to Iran's entrenchment and created the groundwork for the Islamic State to emerge in Iraq and Syria. The United States started withdrawing its troops from Iraq in 2010 and completed the final withdrawal in 2011. But the U.S. military returned to Iraq in 2014 as part of an international coalition to counter ISIS. The Iraq War is often regarded as one of the most controversial U.S. military ventures, mounting debates about its justification, human and financial costs, and the long-term consequences for both Iraq and international politics. This wraps up our list of wars faced by the United States during its history. It's up to you now. What do you think will be the next war that the Americans will be engaged in? And will they again come out on top?